Thanks, Finuala and Voya, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fourth iteration of excellent little-known books. I am going to be doing today's talk on autobiography, biography, and memoir. Joe Tyrrell will be talking tomorrow on books relating to adventure and exploration. I'll be doing non-fiction on Wednesday, which is a smorgasbord of a variety of topics. Finuala will be doing short novels on Thursday, and on Friday I'll be doing fiction. I'm sure many of you already know Joe and Finuala from previous lectures. Joe is a cardiologist, a traveller and a reader. Finuala is a poet and author and senior lecturer at summer school. And I've been in book publishing for most of my adult working life, but I'm also a voracious reader. I have to say books that actually we didn't publish. Anyway, the criteria for selection are a book that I've personally enjoyed, no recently published or heavily hyped books that most readers are likely to have read, including South African. It's not a best of list, but it really attempts to introduce the South African reader to excellent little-known books, particularly those that come from other countries where they've been prize winners, but you may not actually have heard of them. A full list of the books discussed is available on the UCT Summer School website. I think Finuala has provided links in the chat. And at the end of the course, the last slide will have a list of the books discussed in this lecture, which we'll leave up for a little while, and also my email address, and I can also send you the full list if you want them. A perennial question is where to find books. Well, libraries, including the public library system, and if they don't have it, they can always get it for you. Any good bookshop can order them. Amazon.co.uk is very good for secondhand print books. Amazon.com is good for ebooks. iTunes for out-of-print ebooks. Looking at prizes and awards, although I have to say it's not always a recommendation. Sometimes they're very politically correct choices. And obviously newspaper and magazines with good book review columns. So to start, my first choice is the book that I enjoyed most in 2019, A Woman in the Polar Night by Christiane Ritter, which was and still is a bestseller in Germany, and it's never been out of print in German since it was first published in 1938. It's a surprisingly modern book in its writing and in its outlook. I think it's going to be a book that I will reread regularly. In 1934, Christiane Ritter, this is her over here, leaves her teenage daughter in the care of her mother and her sister and her comfortable home, and travels to Spitsbergen in the Antarctic to join her husband, who is standing next to her in this photograph. Svalbard in Spitsbergen is between Iceland and Norway. This is a more detailed map of it. It's quite difficult to get across it. They landed over here and had quite a long journey up to Greyhook, which is where the hut was that they were going to live in. Her husband had been a scientist who had fallen in love with Spitsbergen and decided to stay and become a hunter for a few years. So he'd been there for 3 years already when he invited her to join him, which she did gladly, and went to live with him in this one-roomed hut. This is a picture of it in summer. The book has been so popular that over the years, this hut has become something of a pilgrimage site. There is a website devoted to it. And cruise ships stop here regularly to allow fans to go and have a look at the hut, the one-roomed hut where they lived for an entire year. This is the hut in winter. buried under the snow. When Christiana arrives there, she thinks it's going to be a relaxing trip, a chance to read thick books in the remote quiet, and not least to sleep to my heart's content. But when she arrives, she is quite shocked to realize that they're living in this tiny, very ramshackle hut on the shores of a lonely fjord, hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement, battling the elements every day just to survive. An amiable Norwegian hunter called Carl Nicolaisen joins them there. He's in his 20s and a very cheerful sort. And anxieties over the availability of fresh meat run through the book like a minor key. Carl and Herman set out again and again to find seal, bear, and birds. At first, Christiana is horrified by the freezing cold, bleak landscape, the lack of equipment and supplies. But over time, after encounters with the animals, joining the men on long treks, the perpetual night, she finds herself falling in love with the Arctic's harsh, otherworldly beauty, gaining a great sense of inner peace and a new appreciation for the sanctity of life, which she writes about with insight and delightful wry humour. She writes, "The next day I tell the men of my decision to stay alone in the hut while they go off." The general silence. Then Carl breaks out, "Spitzbergen mania, Spitzbergen mania, now the lady's gone mad." Then they start persuading me as though I were a sick horse. Carl starts off at the end of February. "I shall never forget the beauty of the morning twilight. My husband will accompany him for a short part of the way, carrying the heavy rucksack. The whole sky is a deep lilac, lightening into a tender cobalt blue at the horizon, over the sea of ice. From the east, a pale yellow brightness spreads, and the frozen sea, reflecting the heavenly colours, shines like an immense opal. Where sea and land meet, and where the tidal water thrusts through to the surface around the heavy masses of ice, the colours of the sky are reflected as brightly as in a mirror." She takes to her bed with Ra. It's a strange state of mind that affects those in the north. The eccentricities of each person in the hut grow more marked. Rita knits compulsively and paints. Her husband develops a lunatic miserliness about fuel. Carl talks and sings constantly. Despite that, they live harmoniously. These are photographs that I found on the website of this room that the three of them lived in. This is one of Christiana's paintings, the hut interior, and her sketch of the beast of the stove, which smoked continually. She skis to a freshwater spring in the dark to wash their clothes, wonders how she should cook the seal's flippers and whether they're getting enough vitamins. A year in the Arctic should be compulsory to everyone, she would say in later life. Then you come to realize what is important in life and what isn't. It's a classic memoir and an excellent book that I would highly recommend. The second book is called The Trauma Cleaner by Sarah Krosnostein. There are two stories in this book, told with great sensitivity and insight by Sarah Krosnostein. It's won numerous awards, been shortlisted for a further 8. And it tells the story of Sandra Pancost, who you see in this photograph here. She is a trauma cleaner in Australia and runs a company cleaning intolerable houses where there are hoarders. You can see these are photographs of some of the places they've been in to clean. Among her clients are a woman who sleeps among garbage that she's not put out for 40 years. She lives on top of it. There's a woman who lives with rats, random debris, and terrified delusion. There's the still life of a home that is vacated by accidental overdose. And Sarah Krosnostian has spent a lot of time with Sandra Pancost, watching her bring order and care to these people in these homes, the living and the dead. And the books that she's written is equally extraordinary. In these photographs, you can see that Sandra and her team go in with industrial cleaning equipment, shovels, and crowbars. And I have to say, I found it absolutely fascinating how she talks about how you clean up, for example, the scene of a shooting, get rid of the blood or the smell of death. In Australia, many of the houses are timber, and they quite often find, once they've managed to crowbar a meter of garbage off a floor, that it's actually rotted away underneath, and the garbage was what the person was living on. But what is interesting is the story behind Sandra Pancost. She was born a boy, adopted through the Catholic Church by a family in West Footscray in Melbourne. The father was an extremely violent alcoholic, and both parents were physically and emotionally abusive. Peter, as he was then known, was forced to live in a low shed in the backyard that his father had built, and he was excluded from the family home after 4:30 in the afternoon. He was denied food and access to the bathroom, and he was so malnourished that his teeth started breaking off at the gums. He was born male, and as a little child, he was probably gentle and effeminate. So his mother developed a hatred of her for being what she believed to be homosexual. Sandra ran away, or Peter ran away, when he was 15. Later, he met Linda in this top photograph. They got married when he was 19 and had 2 children, 2 boys. But all the time, Sandra was aware that she was different, and she started exploring the gay community in Melbourne and became aware of trans people. And she realized that that was what she had to do. Staying was not an option. And Sarah Krosnostian is very interesting about her emotional makeup. She makes a break from her marriage and her children. Her wife, to the end of her days, continues to speak very fondly of her. But Sandra was not good at maintaining emotional relationships, and you can imagine why, given her childhood. And yet she shows this extraordinary compassion and sensitivity to the people she helps through her trauma company. She began dancing in clubs in St Kilda, did street prostitution, and eventually became a sex worker on a gold mine. It's actually quite a funny account of rural Australia. She chose to live full-time as a woman while she was transitioning, which was a process that took about 8 years. Later, she met and married her husband, George, and started her trauma cleaning business. One of the reviews said, it's written with sensitivity, insight, and warmth, and Krosnostian has pieced together a compelling history through careful research and interviews. It's no ordinary trauma narrative. We see how the infliction of multiple traumas has left this fascinating woman uniquely placed to restore order among the despair of others. And it's with similar care that Krosnostian has produced this book. It's a humane portrait of a woman who has somehow found fertile ground in the mess of life. A brutal, heartbreaking, and utterly moving story of survival and a quiet triumph. Do read it. By way of contrast, this is the story of another survivor, Alan Johnson, who was brought up with a great deal of love by first his mother and then his sister. He was born into the slums of London, absolutely shocking conditions to think that they existed in the 50s and 60s in England, and rose to become a cabinet minister not once but 5 times in the Labour government. This book has also won the Orwell Prize, the Royal Society of Literature Prize, which is Britain's top political award. And all his titles are the titles of Beatles songs, because Actually, instead of being a politician, as he turned out, his real ambition was to run a rock group, and the Beatles were his heroes. He was born in pre-gentrification Notting Hill, which was a world of slum landlords, gang warfare, race riots, and, it must be said, a strong sense of community. His first home was 2 rooms in a tenement that had been condemned. There was no indoor toilet, no bathroom. The kitchen was the stove on the landing, and the electricity was metered, which meant that the family was constantly scrabbling for shillings and often had to rely on candles for light. As a young teenager, he recounts walking the streets with an old pram, scavenging for coal, and the repeated humiliation of having to ask local shopkeepers for goods on tick. His mother, Lily, a respectable working-class woman from Liverpool, had made the mistake of marrying Steve, a feckless ne'er-do-well who played the piano in local pubs and eventually ran off with a barmaid, after which his only contact with his family was the occasional postal order. Steve was a dark shadow in our lives. My fear wasn't losing a father, it was having one, writes Johnson. Lily and Johnson's sister Linda are the heroes of the story. Lily, whose life was a constant struggle against loneliness, grinding poverty, and poor health, managed in the teeth of great odds to bring up her children decently and with enormous amounts of love. She died of heart disease, age 42, leaving Alan and Linda, age 13 and 16, to fend for themselves. At this point, Linda took over. Resisting attempts to take them into care, she succeeded in persuading the local authority to find them a council flat in Battersea, and she held the fort until Alan was old enough to make his way in the world. His first job, apart from a milk round, was as a postal clerk at the headquarters of razor manufacturer Remington. He later graduated to Tesco's warehouse. All he ever wanted was to be a pop star, and he almost made it. He became a husband and father while still in his teens. This is Alan as a young boy, and this is him marrying his first wife, Judy, when he was 17. She had a child out of wedlock, whom he adopted, and they later went on to have 2 more children. This is his second wife. This is his sister, Linda, who became a second mother to him. This is him, age 19, with 2 of his children, and this is his third wife, Caroline. Later, he became a postman, which was a job that he enjoyed enormously, but it introduced him to trade union politics, which is how he eventually made the move into a political career. And he later had another son. From time to time, you have to pinch yourself as you read this to realize that this is not an account of childhood in Victorian England, it's actually life in England in the 50s and 60s, which was an era when many never had it so good. But far from being a misery memoir, however, it's beautifully observed, it's humorous, it's moving, it's uplifting, it's told with a dry, self-deprecating wit and with not a trace of self-pity. No matter how harsh the details, Alan Johnson writes with a spirit of generous acceptance, of humour and openness, which makes his book anything but a grim catalogue of miseries. It was a bestseller in the UK, and it's highly recommended. The next book is by Lynn Barber, on education. Lynn Barber, shown here in middle age, was a formidable journalist, renowned for the interviews she conducted with people, often coruscating interviews. She was a woman to be feared. So this memoir of hers, quite a slight book, is actually quite a surprise. In 1960, a stranger in a sports car offers a 16-year-old schoolgirl a lift, which she accepts. This was the beginning of the 2 most bizarre years of Lynn Barber's life. The stranger charmed his way into her family. He wined and dined in posh restaurants, whisked her off to Paris for the weekend, and introduced her to his louche friends, all with a delighted agreement of her parents, who hadn't a clue what he was about. And he did this without ever letting on exactly what he did for a living. Only when he proposed and she was on the brink of accepting did she find out something which made her realize she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. Barbara's parents, working class people who had bettered themselves and were determined that their only daughter should better herself still further, are ruthlessly exposed. Barbara's affair as a schoolgirl with Simon, a friend of the notorious slum landlord Peter Ruchman, who was much older than she, this creepy, borderline paedophile boyfriend, was fated by Barbara's parents, who, after a lifetime of encouraging her to get into Oxford, pressurized their daughter in a 180-degree turn to accepting a marriage proposal at 17 instead. Only her discovery of a wife and a couple of children saved her from disaster and sent her to Oxford to study English literature as previously planned. But even though she escaped, Barbara never seems to have got over what she still sees as her parents' betrayal. It's a little told story in this culture that places so much importance on social mobility, of how the achievement of decisive reinvention sometimes estranges children from their parents, with much unintended bitterness, and leaves the children uncertain of who they are. Barbara tells the story, but with such a scrupulous avoidance of insight or speculation that you don't even really know if she understands what her story is about. She worked very hard at Oxford, but only enough to get by in the academic sense. She put fun, glamour, enjoyment, and sex first, everything that her parents' values were not. She broke all her parents' rules and still bagged herself a husband who was handsome, good, and from a top-drawer English family. Barbara's parents had no friends. Her own married life was a whirl of social activity. She also had a colourful and lucrative career that took her to the top of her profession, where she still is, unassailable, admired, and hugely influential. Her memoir is funny, bold, incisive, clever, and interesting, and has been turned into a film starring Carey Mulligan, Peter Sarsgaard, Alfred Molina, Emma Thompson as the headmistress, Rosamund Pike, and Dominic Cooper. I haven't seen it, but I can't wait to. The following book is Richard Shepherd, Unnatural Causes, the life and many deaths of Britain's top forensic pathologist. This has also won many prizes, deservedly so. It was included in the Times Book of the Year, Sunday Times top bestseller. The Times said it was one of the most fascinating books I have read in a long time. It's engrossing, a haunting page turner, a book I could not put down. I can only echo that. I read it twice, the second time in preparation for this course, and I found it a page turner the second time around as well. Richard Shepherd is a leading forensic pathologist with over 30 years and 23,000 postmortems under his belt. And his book charts his relentless pursuit of the truth in determining how each of the patients died. From the victims of mass disasters to homicides to those who've died in police custody or in their own homes from unknown causes, it's his job to ascertain a cause of death. Each case is described with intrigue and detail, and it's surprisingly satisfying to learn of the methodical approach and the routine that each postmortem entails, and even more satisfying to learn of his verdict. The dead do not hide the truth, he says, and they never lie. Through me, the dead can speak. He describes the difference between somatic death and cellular death, that a common response to hypothermia is actually to take off one's clothes, that the survivors have described feeling very hot as the temperature dropped and believed that stripping off was an appropriate response, and that victims of hypothermia will often seek to die in an enclosed space, such as in corners or under tables, the so-called hide and die syndrome. He explains that post-death, the blood vessels provide easy channels for bacteria inside the body to spread, resulting in the extraordinary and beautiful fern-like pattern of the veins, clearly etched on the skin as though tattooed in brown. In an investigation into a death in prison, where the Nigerian prisoner had been restrained with force, he discovers that the man had sickle cell trait, which is common in those of African or Caribbean origin. The advantage of this trait is that it protects against malaria, but it also results in thickening of the blood, so that restraint in any critical area can cause oxygen deprivation and death. So he works with the police for many years, training them in how to restrain people who might have the sickle cell trait in such a way that it doesn't lead to their death. He shares with us some of his most high-profile cases. He represented the UK victims in the 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers, which turned out to be 67 people, and he worked with the team in New York. He writes, the trailers were filling fast. Eventually, it was established that there were 2,735 victims, and in total, something like 70,000 body parts or fragments were found. Many of the bodies had been pulverized, either by the initial explosion or when the buildings came down. An anthropologist who worked sifting through the debris was, like many others involved in the disaster, traumatized by it. After months of sieving for bits of human tissue and bone, she developed a horror of flying. When she returned to the UK before boarding her flight, she wrote her name on every part of her body, every single limb, in case the plane crashed and she was dismembered. In fact, it was many years before she worked again. Richard Shepherd also reviewed the evidence of the original inquest into Princess Diana's death, in which he concludes that it was an unfortunate accident that would have been preventable if she and Dodi had been wearing seatbelts. He also represented the UK victims in the 9/11 attacks, and he reviewed the evidence and the post-mortems of Harold Shipman's victims. He was a GP serial killer who killed many of his patients with morphine overdoses. In addition to the professional turmoil, Shepherd does not shy away from describing the personal cost to his mental health and his family that his career caused him. He ended up with post-traumatic stress syndrome, although he didn't recognize it for a number of months. From the beginning, family and medicine have been closely intertwined in his life, and from the death of his mother at 9 to the emotional abyss in his own marriage, we understand the conflict and tension there is between the love for one's family and the love for one's vocation and calling. It's a reflective and poignant memoir, a sober and exceptionally honest account, a meditation on mortality and life, a love letter to forensic pathology, and a fascinating collection of case studies and vignettes. I thought it was better than Henry Marsh's Do No Harm, and I would love to see more of it and more of his writing. The next book is by Deborah Orr Motherwell. This was also shortlisted for a number of prizes. When journalist Deborah Orr died from breast cancer aged 57, it provoked a series of evocative, honest, and very funny stories about her singular vision, her sandpaper rough tongue, and the wild and cussed streak that ran right through her core. Motherwell, A Girlhood, is the memoir that she wrote shortly before her death, showcases all these qualities and more. Ostensibly, the story of her awkward relationship with her formidable mother, Wynne. The book, which is named after the town Motherwell, where Orr grew up, is also a meditation on motherhood and a powerful depiction of a particular kind of working class Scottish life in